The vast Libyan desert offered no shade, no easy pathways, and no mercy. In the early 1940s, near the coastal town of Sirte, the land was defined by burning horizons, sun-baked earth, and the ancient rhythm of nomadic life. Here, under the scorching heat of the Mediterranean sun, a child named Muammar Gaddafi was born into a small goat-and camel herding family belonging to the Kadhadfa tribe. His home was not built of stone or brick. It was a humble Bedouin tent woven from coarse goat hair, pitched wherever there was enough dry brush and water to keep their few animals alive. For the young boy, the world began in the silence of these vast open spaces. The Kadhadfa were an Arabized Berber tribe, poor in material wealth but rich in proud traditions. They were desert dwellers who lived far removed from the political power centers of Tripoli and Benghazi. Life was a continuous struggle for basic survival. Water was drawn carefully from deep wells, food was simple, and survival depended entirely on family loyalty, self-reliance, and physical endurance. During his earliest years, Libya was a battlefield for foreign empires. Italy had occupied the territory as a colony, subjecting the local population to brutal suppression and displacement. World War II tore across the North African sands, leaving behind unexploded mines, wrecked military vehicles, and deep scars in the memory of the native population. Although the child was too young to fully understand World War tactics, the ambient atmosphere of foreign occupation and military presence left an indelible impression on him. His grandfather had died fighting against the Italian colonial forces, a fact that was repeated often around the nighttime campfires. These stories framed his early understanding of the world. Foreigners were invaders, strength was the only defense, and honor had to be preserved at any cost. As the youngest child and only son in his family, Muammar was loved dearly, but he was not spared the hard realities of desert life. His father, Mohammed Abdul Salam, worked tirelessly to feed the family through herding and small-scale agriculture. Unlike most children of his background, whose lives were confined entirely to tribal duties, Muammar showed an early curiosity for learning. His father, despite being illiterate himself, recognized his son's sharp mind and made the uncommon decision to pay for his basic education. His education began with traditional religious instruction. Under the guidance of a local Islamic teacher, the boy memorized verses of the Quran. Sitting on bare ground beneath the canvas of a tent or under the shelter of a date palm, he repeated the holy texts until they were etched into his memory. This early religious grounding gave him a strong command of the Arabic language and a lasting respect for Islamic values, which would later form a core pillar of his political ideology. When Muammar reached the age of 9, his family saved enough money to send him to a primary school in the town of Sirte. This transition marked his first step outside the close community of his nomadic tribe. Sirte was not a large metropolis, but to a boy from the open desert, it was a completely different world. It was a world dominated by settled townspeople, small shopkeepers, and government officials. School life in Sirte was a difficult experience for the young Bedouin. His classmates were mostly urban children who wore cleaner clothes and came from wealthier families. They looked down on the boy from the desert. They made fun of his worn-out, traditional robes, his dusty shoes, and his rough desert accent. Because his family could not afford a house or a rental room in town, Muammar had no proper place to stay during the school week. Every night after class, while other boys returned home to hot meals and soft beds, Muammar walked to the local mosque. He slept on the simple woven mats of the mosque floor, using his folded cloak as a pillow. On Friday afternoons, when the school week ended, he would begin a long, arduous trek on foot back to his family's tent in the desert. He often walked up to 20 miles across the hot sand, carrying his notebooks in a small bundle. On Sunday evenings, he made the same long walk back to Sirte. Instead of crushing his spirit, the teasing and isolation at school sparked a deep, quiet resilience inside him. He grew proud of his Bedouin roots. In his eyes, the city dwellers were soft, corrupt, and overly dependent on easy comforts, while the desert people possessed true courage, purity, and dignity. He came to view his poverty not as a disgrace, but as proof of his moral strength. The social gap he experienced in Sirte created a lifelong hatred of class inequality and social injustice. By the early 1950s, the political map of North Africa was changing rapidly. In 1951, Libya declared its independence, becoming the United Kingdom of Libya under King Idris I. However, independence brought little immediate improvement to the lives of ordinary Libyans, especially those in rural areas. The country was poor, relying heavily on foreign aid and hosting large British and American military bases. To many young Libyans, King Idris seemed like a distant monarch who was far too friendly with foreign Western powers. The daily hardships of the desert, combined with his feeling of being an outsider in town, shaped Muammar's personality during his early adolescence. He became serious, introspective, and intensely focused. He spent long hours reading whatever books and newspapers he could find, eager to understand the world beyond the Gulf of Sirte. The vast silence of the desert had taught him patience, but his experiences at school had given him an appetite to prove himself. As his primary school years drew to a close, his family moved further south to the Fezzan region, settling near the oasis city of Sebha. This move marked the end of his childhood in Sirte and opened a new chapter in his life. He was no longer just a poor desert boy trying to survive in a hostile classroom. He was growing into an ambitious young man whose fierce national pride and deep suspicion of foreign influence were about to find a larger voice. The lessons of the desert, hardness, self-reliance, and an unyielding pride, would stay with him forever, setting the stage for his eventual journey from the sands of Sirte to the center of Libyan politics. The vast expanse of the Libyan desert gave way to a different kind of landscape in the oasis city of Sebha, located in the deep south of the country. For the teenage Muammar Gaddafi, the move to Sebha marked a dramatic turning point in his life. The town was a historic crossroads of trans-Saharan trade routes, characterized by dusty streets, mud brick buildings, date palm groves, and a diverse population of Arabs, Tuaregs, and Fezzanese locals. More importantly, Sebha was home to the region's main secondary school, a rare hub of education in an otherwise impoverished hinterland. It was within these dusty classrooms and school courtyards that the young desert wanderer would transform into a politicized revolutionary. Sebha Secondary School was a crucible of intellectual awakening and political ferment during the mid-1950s. While Libya had gained its formal independence in 1951, the country remained politically fragmented, economically weak, and heavily dependent on foreign powers. King Idris I, the monarch who sat upon the newly established throne, was viewed by many rural Libyans as a distant and conservative figure. The royal government maintained close ties with Great Britain and the United States, allowing both nations to keep strategic military bases on Libyan soil. For a young man who had grown up listening to campfire tales of anti-colonial resistance and the bitter humiliation of Italian occupation, the continued presence of foreign troops on Libyan land was an intolerable insult to national dignity. The political atmosphere in Sebha was charged with electricity. Egyptian radio broadcasts filled the airwaves, crackling through transistor radios in local coffee shops and student dormitories. At the center of this cultural and political wave was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic leader of Egypt who had seized power in 1952. Nasser championed the ideals of Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, and socialist-leaning reform. He called for the unity of all Arab peoples, the eradication of foreign colonial influence, and the restoration of Arab pride on the global stage. His booming voice, broadcast across North Africa and the Middle East, captured the imagination of millions of young Arabs who felt humiliated by decades of foreign domination and the ongoing struggle against Israel. Muammar Gaddafi listened to Nasser's speeches with rapt attention. To the teenage student, Nasser was not merely a foreign leader. He was a living hero and a symbol of what an Arab nation could achieve when it stood up to Western imperialism. Gaddafi absorbed every word of Nasser's philosophy, internalizing the concepts of Arab unity, popular sovereignty, and revolutionary struggle. The radio broadcasts became his daily lessons in geopolitics, teaching him that the artificial borders drawn by European colonial powers were barriers to true Arab liberation that needed to be dismantled. Within the walls of Sebha Secondary School, Gaddafi quickly emerged as a serious, intense, and magnetic student. He was not interested in casual teenage amusements or social gatherings. Instead, his entire focus was directed toward reading political literature, discussing current events, and debating ideology with his peers. He gathered a small, tight-knit circle of loyal friends and fellow students who shared his growing dissatisfaction with the Libyan monarchy and his passion for Arab nationalism. These young men formed clandestine study groups, meeting in secluded corners of the school, private rooms, or out among the desert dunes surrounding the oasis to discuss politics in hushed tones. Gaddafi's leadership qualities became apparent during these formative years. He possessed a natural intensity and an unwavering conviction that set him apart from his classmates. He was a persuasive speaker, able to articulate complex political ideas with simple, striking language drawn from his deep knowledge of Islamic history and Bedouin traditions. He argued passionately that Libya's wealth, particularly its newly discovered potential, belonged to the Libyan people rather than foreign corporations or a detached royal elite. He urged his peers to wake up from their political apathy and recognize that their generation bore the responsibility of transforming the nation. The political tension in Sebha reached a boiling point with major regional and international events, most notably the 1956 Suez Crisis. When Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt following Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, the Arab world erupted in outrage and solidarity. In Sebha, the crisis galvanized the student body. Muammar Gaddafi seized the moment to organize and lead the school's first major political demonstrations. Walking out of the classrooms and into the dusty streets of the oasis town, Gaddafi marched at the head of a crowd of students, waving banners and chanting anti-imperialist slogans in support of Egypt and Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was his first taste of public political action. The demonstration was a powerful display of youthful defiance against the established order. For Gaddafi, marching through the streets of Sebha confirmed his belief that collective action could challenge authority and that ordinary people possess the power to make their voices heard. The local authorities and school administration reacted swiftly to the student protests. Viewing political activism as a threat to public order and a challenge to the monarchy, the school administration cracked down on the student organizers. Muammar Gaddafi, as the primary ringleader and most vocal agitator, was targeted directly. He was formally expelled from Sebha Secondary School, a punishment intended to silence him and deter other students from following his path. Expulsion from school was a severe blow to a young man striving to better his life through education, but it did nothing to dampen his revolutionary zeal. In fact, it validated his sense of grievance against the existing political system. Rather than retreating into quiet submission, Gaddafi continued his education elsewhere, eventually moving to complete his secondary studies in the coastal city of Misrata. In Misrata, he continued his clandestine political activities, expanding his network of like-minded nationalist youths and deepening his clandestine contacts. As the years of his youth drew to a close, Gaddafi faced a crucial personal crossroads. He looked at the political landscape of Libya and realized that peaceful protests, school debates, and underground study groups would never be enough to overthrow a deeply entrenched monarchy supported by foreign powers. The royal government was insulated from popular pressure, and political parties were strictly banned. If real change was going to come to Libya, it required a force capable of bypassing the traditional political structure entirely. The answer, Gaddafi concluded, lay within the state apparatus itself, specifically within the military. By entering the armed forces, young nationalist officers could infiltrate the system, build a secret military organization, and wait for the strategic moment to strike. This realization marked his decision to pursue a formal military career. He applied to and was accepted into the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, stepping away from the open protests of student life and entering the disciplined, hierarchical world of the armed forces. Here, beneath the surface of a royal military institution, the young revolutionary would quietly begin laying the groundwork for the overthrow of the Libyan crown. The year was 1969, and the Kingdom of Libya was resting on a foundation of sand. Beneath the glittering surface of newly discovered oil wealth and the quiet stability promised by King Idris I, deep currents of discontent were swirling. The aging monarch, frail and weary of governance, spent long periods abroad seeking medical treatment in Turkey and Greece, leaving a power vacuum and a deeply bureaucratic, stagnant government in his wake. Across the vast North African nation, ordinary citizens watched as foreign powers maintained military dominance over their soil, while a small elite grew wealthy on oil concessions granted to Western corporations. In the military barracks, a quiet, clandestine network of young, fiercely nationalistic officers had been weaving a web of conspiracy for years. At the center of this secret cell stood a 27-year-old captain named Muammar Gaddafi, a man whose absolute dedication to Arab nationalism and revolutionary transformation had turned him into an uncompromising mastermind of change. For years, Gaddafi and his trusted comrades in the Free Unionist Officers movement had lived double lives. Inside the military academy and various army garrisons across the country, they played the part of loyal, disciplined officers, earning promotions and gaining the trust of their superiors. But behind closed doors, in cramped barracks rooms and silent desert encampments under the cover of night, they plotted the systematic overthrow of the monarchy. They studied the structures of power, mapped out key communication nodes, and recruited like-minded soldiers who shared their burning desire to reclaim Libyan sovereignty. The plan required meticulous patience, absolute secrecy, and precise timing. A single slip, a stray word overheard by royal intelligence agents, or a moment of hesitation could mean public execution or a lifetime in a dark prison cell. By the late summer of 1969, the moment had finally arrived. King Idris was away in Europe, and the royal government was paralyzed by administrative inertia. Rumors of succession disputes and palace intrigue further weakened the regime's grip on reality. Gaddafi and his inner circle realized that waiting any longer would only allow the monarchy to consolidate its ties with foreign intelligence services or crush their embryonic movement. The operation was codenamed Operation Jerusalem, a symbolic nod to the broader pan-Arab struggle. The date was set for September 1, 1969. The strategy was bold in its simplicity. Move swiftly, seize control of communication centers, radio stations, and airports before anyone realized what was happening, and isolate the royal authorities completely. In the dead of night, under a brilliant canopy of desert stars, the clandestine machinery of the revolution roared into motion. Young officers and enlisted men who had been secretly sworn into the Free Unionist Officers movement slipped out of their barracks in Benghazi, Tripoli, and other strategic cities. There were no massive columns of tanks rolling through the streets in bloody combat, and there was no prolonged artillery fire shaking the midnight air. Instead, the coup was executed with astonishing speed, discipline, and a clinical lack of resistance. Conspiring officers took control of police stations, telephone exchanges, and government ministries while the nation slept. In Benghazi, the royal capital and the administrative heart of the eastern region, Captain Muammar Gaddafi established his command center. Wearing his crisp military uniform, radiating intense focus and unshakable authority, he directed the unfolding operations with cool precision. Radios crackled with coded messages from army units reporting successful objectives secured without a single shot fired. Radio broadcasting stations in Tripoli and Benghazi were quickly occupied by revolutionary troops, cutting off the official government voice and preparing the stage for a dramatic announcement that would alter the course of Libyan history forever. As the first pale rays of dawn began to paint the Mediterranean horizon on September 1, 1969, the sleepy populace of Libya woke up to a transformed world. Citizens tuning into their morning radio broadcasts did not hear the usual classical music or religious programming. Instead, a strong, youthful, and uncompromising voice broke through the static. It was Captain Muammar Gaddafi, speaking directly to the nation with fiery eloquence. He announced that the corrupt monarchy had been overthrown, that a new era of freedom, socialism, and unity had begun, and that Libya had finally taken its destiny back into its own hands. The reaction across the country was a mixture of stunned disbelief, cautious curiosity, and sudden, bubbling euphoria. In the streets of Tripoli and Benghazi, crowds began to gather, listening intently to loudspeakers and transistor radios. Many people, particularly the younger generation, urban workers, and rural poor who had felt ignored by King Idris's conservative government, erupted into spontaneous celebrations. They waved flags, chanted nationalist slogans, and embraced one another in public squares. The oppressive weight of the old order had vanished almost overnight, replaced by the electric, unpredictable energy of a new dawn. Foreign governments and international intelligence agencies were caught entirely off guard. Western embassies in Tripoli scrambled to decipher who these young officers were and what their intentions were regarding oil supplies, foreign military bases, and international alliances. British and American diplomats frantically wired their capitals, trying to gather intelligence on the mysterious 27-year-old captain who had suddenly seized control of a strategically vital oil-rich nation. The British government, which had maintained deep defense ties with King Idris, watched helplessly as its historic influence evaporated in a matter of hours. King Idris, resting in Kemna, Greece, received the devastating news of the coup through international wire services. Recognizing that his decades-long reign had come to an abrupt and irreversible end, he formally abdicated his throne in a brief statement, choosing exile in Egypt rather than attempting a bloody and hopeless civil war to reclaim his crown. The royal era, which had begun with independence in 1951, dissolved into the history books with astonishing quietness, leaving an absolute vacuum of power at the center of the Libyan state. For Muammar Gaddafi, the successful seizure of power was not the ultimate destination, but merely the starting line. At just 27 years of age, the desert-born revolutionary found himself thrust from the shadows of clandestine conspiracy into the dazzling, blinding spotlight of absolute leadership. He did not claim the title of president or prime minister. Instead, he assumed the rank of colonel and the title of leader of the revolution, positioning himself not as a traditional politician, but as the supreme embodiment of the nation's collective will. Standing atop the balcony of command, looking out over a cheering nation, the young colonel knew that the real challenge had only just begun. He now had to build a brand new country from the ashes of the monarchy. The dust of the September Revolution had barely settled over the sun-drenched streets of Tripoli and Benghazi when the new rulers of Libya faced the staggering reality of governance. A successful coup was one thing, but constructing an entirely new political, social, and economic order from the remnants of a dismantled monarchy required a monumental exertion of will. At the helm of this transformation stood Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, a 27-year-old leader driven by a fiery blend of pan-Arab nationalism, anti-imperialist fervor, and a profound personal mission to redeem the dignity of the Libyan people. For Gaddafi and his fellow members of the Revolutionary Command Council, or RCC, the primary objective was absolute and non-negotiable, completely erasing every vestige of foreign domination and domestic inequality that had characterized the era of King Idris. The most immediate and symbolic target of the new regime was the presence of foreign military bases on Libyan soil. For decades, Western powers had treated the strategic North African coastline as an unsinkable aircraft carrier and a vital staging ground for global military operations. Wheelis Air Base, located just east of Tripoli, was the largest United States Air Force installation outside of the American mainland, housing thousands of service members and serving as a constant, glaring reminder of foreign oversight. British forces similarly occupied key strategic facilities in Tobruk and El Adem, exercising significant control over Libyan airspace and defense policy. To Gaddafi, true independence was a cruel illusion as long as foreign troops patrolled Libyan streets and foreign flags flew over local military installations. With characteristic boldness, the young colonel wasted no time in confronting the superpowers. In late 1969, shortly after consolidating power, the RCC formally demanded the complete and unconditional evacuation of all British and American military personnel. Western diplomats, initially dismissive of the young officers and expecting the regime to collapse under its own weight, quickly realized they were dealing with a deeply resolute adversary. Negotiations were tense, characterized by fiery public speeches from Gaddafi that galvanized domestic support and left little room for compromise. Faced with the reality of a hostile local population and a government unwilling to back down, the British and American governments capitulated. By March 1970, the last foreign soldier had departed Wheelis Air Base, and the installation was officially renamed Mitiga Air Base. The departure of foreign troops was hailed across the country as a historic triumph, a moment when Libya finally shook off the chains of colonial legacy and stood tall on the international stage. With foreign boots removed from Libyan soil, Gaddafi turned his intense focus toward the nation's economic juggernaut, oil. Discovered in commercial quantities in the late 1950s, Libya's vast petroleum reserves had rapidly transformed the country from one of the poorest nations in the world into a lucrative prize for foreign oil conglomerates. However, under the monarchy, the lion's share of the profits flowed directly into the bank accounts of Western corporations, while ordinary Libyans saw very little benefit from the black gold flowing beneath their feet. Concessions had been granted on terms heavily favorable to foreign companies, and the royal government had lacked both the political will and the technical expertise to challenge the status quo. Gaddafi and his economic advisors recognized that control over oil was the ultimate instrument of national sovereignty. The regime initiated a systematic and aggressive campaign to renegotiate oil contracts, demanding higher prices per barrel and a greater share of state ownership in foreign operations. When major international oil companies attempted to call the bluff of the young revolutionary government by refusing production increases or resisting price hikes, Gaddafi remained unyielding. He understood that Libya held a crucial strategic advantage. Its oil was high-quality, low-sulfur crude, located close to European markets, making it indispensable to Western economies. To enforce compliance, the Libyan government imposed production cutbacks on uncooperative companies, effectively starving them of revenue until they agreed to terms. One by one, major international corporations buckled under the pressure, accepting retroactive tax increases and higher royalty payments. In the years that followed, the RCC took the decisive step of nationalizing key sectors of the oil industry, establishing the National Oil Corporation to manage extraction and distribution. Foreign-owned assets were progressively brought under state control, and the enormous revenues generated by petroleum exports were redirected away from foreign boardrooms and into the national treasury. This dramatic assertion of economic control provided Gaddafi with the financial ammunition he needed to fund his ambitious domestic reforms and project his influence across the Arab and African worlds. Parallel to the restructuring of the economy, Gaddafi pursued an ambitious and uncompromising vision of Arab unity. Deeply inspired by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, whom Gaddafi idolized as the towering hero of the Arab world, the young Libyan leader viewed his country's revolution not as an isolated national event, but as a crucial building block for a unified pan-Arab superpower. To Gaddafi, the artificial borders carved into the desert by European colonial powers were illegitimate scars that divided a single Arab nation. He believed that only by pooling their resources, populations, and military might could Arab states stand up against imperialism, Zionism, and Western dominance. Throughout the early 1970s, Gaddafi poured his energy into relentless diplomatic initiatives aimed at merging Libya with its neighbors. He engaged in high-stakes negotiations with Egypt, Sudan, Syria, and Tunisia, proposing various blueprints for political union, federal federation, and shared governance. In 1972, he signed the Tripoli Charter with Egypt and Syria, creating the Federation of Arab Republics, a grand project designed to integrate the three nations into a cohesive political and military entity. However, these ambitious plans repeatedly crashed against the harsh rocks of political reality. Mutual suspicions among regional leaders, conflicting national interests, and personal rivalries among heads of state doomed the federations to failure. Nasser's untimely death in September 1970 was a devastating personal blow to Gaddafi, robbing him of his primary mentor and ideological anchor. Without Nasser's moderating influence and towering stature, Gaddafi's passionate push for unity often alienated fellow Arab leaders, who viewed his utopian schemes as impulsive and overbearing. Despite these repeated diplomatic frustrations, Gaddafi refused to abandon his pan-Arab ideals. Instead, his failure to achieve immediate unity with traditional Arab states only fueled his determination to find alternative paths to revolutionary transformation, turning his gaze increasingly toward the African continent and the broader developing world. Domestically, the dismantling of the old monarchy required the creation of new institutions to reflect the revolutionary spirit of the new era. The traditional judicial and legislative structures were systematically dissolved. The Constitution of 1951 was abrogated, and political parties were strictly banned. As Gaddafi argued that partisan politics only served to divide society and invite foreign corruption. In their place, the Revolutionary Command Council ruled by decree, consolidating all executive and legislative authority into the hands of the young officers who had seized power on that quiet September night. Yet, even as he consolidated power, Gaddafi was careful to project the image of a humble servant of the people rather than an autocratic dictator. He maintained a relatively austere personal lifestyle, frequently sleeping in a traditional Bedouin tent even after achieving absolute power, a deliberate choice designed to emphasize his connection to the common people and his rejection of royal luxury. He traveled extensively across the country, meeting with tribal elders, workers, and students, listening to their grievances and preaching the gospel of self-reliance, social justice, and revolutionary duty. The early years of Gaddafi's rule laid the foundational architecture of modern Libya. By successfully expelling foreign military bases, nationalizing the oil wealth, and establishing direct control over the state apparatus, the young colonel proved that his regime was not a temporary flash in the pan, but a permanent, disruptive force in global politics. The desert kingdom of King Idris was gone, replaced by a turbulent, ambitious, and heavily centralized revolutionary state. As Gaddafi looked out over a changing landscape of nationalized oil fields and cheering crowds, he remained convinced that his unique brand of revolutionary leadership would guide Libya into a golden age of prosperity and regional leadership. Little did he know that the very instruments of absolute control he was forging would eventually set the stage for decades of complex trials, international isolation, and profound historical controversy. By the mid-1970s, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had successfully dismantled the old monarchy, expelled foreign military bases from Libyan soil, and seized national control over the country's immense oil wealth. Yet, despite these monumental changes, the young leader was deeply dissatisfied with the political models that dominated the rest of the world. He looked at Western-style parliamentary democracy and saw a hollow illusion, a system where wealthy elites manipulated elections and ordinary citizens were reduced to mere spectators who cast a ballot once every few years and were then forgotten. At the same time, he rejected Soviet-style communism, believing that state-controlled atheism and rigid Marxism were incompatible with Arab culture and Islamic values. Gaddafi became obsessed with finding a completely new path forward, a unique political philosophy that would give power directly to the people, without the corrupting influence of politicians, political parties, or parliaments. This grand ambition crystallized into what Gaddafi termed the Third Universal Theory, a political doctrine that he presented as an alternative to both capitalism and communism. The core ideas of this new philosophy were meticulously written down in a series of small, bright green booklets that would eventually become known simply as the Green Book. First published in 1976, the first volume of the Green Book targeted the very foundation of modern representative government, boldly declaring that democracy meant the authority of the people, not the power of an elected parliament. Gaddafi argued that representation was a fraud, asserting that any parliament that claimed to speak on behalf of the public was actually usurping the people's sovereign voice. In his view, true democracy could only exist if every single citizen participated directly in decision-making, without intermediaries, representatives, or middlemen. The release of the Green Book marked the beginning of an extraordinary ideological campaign across Libya. The little green volumes were printed in millions of copies and translated into numerous languages, intended by their author as a universal guide for the entire human race. Inside Libya, the Green Book became a mandatory text across all levels of education. Students in universities and children in primary schools were required to study its pages, memorize its core tenets, and debate its principles in classrooms. State-run television broadcasts played continuous readings from the book, and its famous slogans were painted on walls, billboards, and public buildings from the Mediterranean coast deep into the Sahara Desert. To question the ideas inside the Green Book was no longer just a political disagreement. It was treated as a challenge to the revolution itself. To put the radical theories of the Green Book into practice, Gaddafi introduced a completely new system of governance known as the Jamahiriya, a term that translates roughly as a state of the masses. In March 1977, during a massive televised meeting of the General People's Congress in the southern city of Sabah, the official name of the country was changed to the Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. Under this new structure, traditional government ministries were systematically dismantled or rebranded, and a complex hierarchy of popular committees and basic people's congresses was established across every neighborhood, village, and workplace. The theory was wonderfully simple on paper. Ordinary citizens would gather in local assemblies to debate local issues, national policies, laws, and budgets, voting directly on every matter of state importance. Their decisions would then be passed upward through regional congresses to the national level, ensuring that power flowed purely from the bottom up. However, the reality of implementing the Jamahiriya proved to be far more complicated and chaotic than the utopian vision presented in Gaddafi's writings. While citizens were encouraged to participate in local debates and vote on public affairs, the ultimate control over the direction of the state remained firmly concentrated in the hands of Gaddafi and his inner circle of revolutionary advisors. The abolition of traditional administrative structures created a vast bureaucratic vacuum, where lines of authority became increasingly blurred. Important national decisions were frequently made not through the slow, deliberative process of the people's congresses, but through sudden decrees issued by Gaddafi or implemented by his revolutionary committees. The promise of direct popular rule coexisted awkwardly with the reality of an authoritarian state where opposition to the colonel's vision was not tolerated. Furthermore, the economic and social policies dictated by subsequent volumes of the Green Book began to disrupt daily life in profound ways. Later volumes tackled the subjects of economics and social life, leading to sweeping campaigns against private property, commercial retail, and traditional employment structures. Gaddafi argued that wage labor was a form of modern slavery and that individuals should only own the homes they lived in and the tools they used for their personal work. Small businesses were nationalized or restricted, and state-run supermarkets were introduced to distribute goods to the populace. While these measures were framed as steps toward absolute equality and social justice, they frequently resulted in economic inefficiency, severe shortages of consumer goods, and widespread frustration among merchants and middle-class citizens who saw their livelihoods upended. Despite the growing economic hurdles and administrative confusion, the introduction of the Green Book and the establishment of the Jamahiriya cemented Gaddafi's status as a unique and unorthodox political thinker on the global stage. He viewed himself not merely as the leader of a North African nation, but as a revolutionary philosopher on par with history's greatest political visionaries. Foreign delegations, diplomats, and international journalists traveled to Tripoli to interview the colonel in his Bedouin tent, eager to understand the inner workings of his desert democracy. Yet, beneath the philosophical rhetoric of popular freedom, the Jamahiriya was rapidly evolving into a deeply personal autocracy. The masses were given a theoretical voice, but the microphone was ultimately controlled by one man. As Libya entered the late 1970s, the grand experiment of the Green Book stood as a testament to Gaddafi's radical imagination, permanently altering the political landscape of the nation while setting the stage for decades of complex internal control and rising international tension. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the political landscape of Libya had undergone a staggering transformation. With the official establishment of the Jamahiriya and the widespread indoctrination of the Green Book, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had successfully dismantled the conventional machinery of government. Yet, a fundamental contradiction lay at the heart of his new political order. While the official ideology preached absolute direct democracy and the total elimination of traditional authority, the actual distribution of power told a very different story. Gaddafi had systematically removed every institutional check upon his own influence, creating a vacuum where he alone stood as the ultimate arbiter of the nation's destiny. He ruled without a crown, without the conventional title of president, prime minister, or king, preferring instead the modest military rank of colonel. But this title was merely a rhetorical shield. In practice, he exercised total control over every lever of the Libyan state. To understand how Gaddafi maintained this iron grip without holding a traditional executive office, one must look closely at the unique structures of power he erected around himself. Having rejected standard governmental ministries and parliamentary bodies, he needed alternative mechanisms to enforce his will and suppress any form of political dissent. The primary vehicle for this control was the network of revolutionary committees. Originally conceived as grassroots groups of enthusiastic young supporters, tasked with spreading the revolutionary message of the Green Book, these committees quickly evolved into a powerful and feared internal security apparatus. They operated independently of traditional police forces and local congresses, functioning as ideological watchdogs embedded in schools, universities, military units, state offices, and residential neighborhoods. Their official purpose was to protect the purity of the revolution, but their practical effect was the creation of an atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. Within this new system, loyalty to Gaddafi and loyalty to the revolution became indistinguishable. The revolutionary committees held immense arbitrary power, able to interrogate citizens, monitor private communications, and denounce suspected dissidents. Public loyalty tests and ideological seminars became a regular feature of daily life for Libyan citizens. Those who embraced the regime and actively participated in committee activities could secure professional advancement, social standing, and state patronage. Conversely, anyone who questioned the wisdom of the Green Book, criticized the economic policies of the Jamahiriya, or expressed nostalgia for the pre-1969 monarchy faced severe repercussions. Dissent was treated not merely as a legal infraction, but as an act of treason against the people themselves. Independent political parties remained strictly banned, and the formation of any unauthorized civic organization, trade union, or intellectual gathering was treated as a grave threat to state security. As the years progressed, the state security apparatus expanded to encompass a web of specialized intelligence agencies and internal security units designed to preempt any potential military coups or civilian uprisings. Libya had entered the revolutionary stage through a military takeover led by a group of young officers, and Gaddafi remained acutely aware that power could just as easily be seized by other ambitious members of the armed forces. To safeguard his position, he deliberately fragmented the military command structure, frequently rotating senior officers, creating rival security branches, and relying heavily on trusted members of his own tribe, the Kadadfa, as well as allied clans from the Sirte and Fezzan regions. Regular military units were often kept underfunded or monitored by revolutionary committee cadres to ensure their political reliability, while elite parallel military units were established to protect the central regime directly. Parallel to this growing security state, a pervasive and intense personality cult was meticulously constructed around the person of Colonel Gaddafi. State-controlled media channels broadcasted his speeches for hours on end, turning his theoretical musings and political directives into mandatory daily listening for the populace. Huge portraits, murals, and banners featuring his face adorned public squares, government buildings, highway billboards, and textbook covers across the entire country. His famous Bedouin tent, which he frequently used to receive foreign dignitaries and host official meetings even when traveling abroad, became a powerful symbol of his self-styled image as a humble ascetic warrior rooted in authentic desert traditions, contrasting sharply with the immense wealth and absolute authority he actually wielded. Citizens were encouraged to view him not merely as a political leader, but as a visionary guide, a teacher, and a father figure to the entire nation. This personality cult and the concentration of authority increasingly personalized the nature of Libyan governance. Over time, state institutions became entirely subservient to Gaddafi's personal whims, moods, and shifting ideological priorities. Decisions that affected the national economy, foreign policy, and domestic administration were frequently made on the spot during informal meetings or late-night consultations with a small, shifting circle of family members, loyal confidants, and revolutionary veterans. There were no established institutional channels to challenge these decisions or offer constructive criticism. If a policy failed or created severe shortages, the blame was routinely deflected onto corrupt bureaucrats or external saboteurs, while the foundational ideas of the leader remained completely insulated from critique. For ordinary Libyans, navigating this environment required a careful and exhausting balancing act. On one hand, the state provided extensive social benefits, subsidized housing, free education, and health care funded by petroleum revenues, which ensured a basic standard of living that satisfied many citizens, particularly those from poorer backgrounds who had benefited directly from the social shifts of the revolution. On the other hand, the cost of this security was the complete surrender of political freedom and personal expression. People learned to censor their conversations in public places, cafes, and workplaces, well aware that informants from the revolutionary committees could be listening anywhere. A careless joke or an offhand complaint about the price of goods could result in sudden arrest, interrogation, or long-term imprisonment without trial. Political repression in Libya during this era was not confined within national borders. As opposition groups began to form among exiled dissidents and students living abroad in Europe, the Middle East, and North America, Gaddafi's security apparatus extended its reach internationally. Libyan intelligence agents and revolutionary committees targeted prominent critics living overseas, leading to a series of high-profile assassinations and violent confrontations in foreign capitals during the late 1970s and 1980s. These actions further strained Libya's diplomatic relations with Western democracies and isolated the country on the global stage, reinforcing the bunker mentality that characterized the regime in Tripoli. Inside the country, public executions of political opponents, televised confessions of alleged subversives, and sweeping crackdowns on Islamist movements and secular liberals alike served as grim reminders of the regime's zero-tolerance policy toward organized opposition. The most infamous institutional symbol of this repression was Abu Salim prison in Tripoli, where hundreds of political prisoners were held under brutal conditions over the decades, creating deep, unresolved grievances that would fester beneath the surface of Libyan society for generations. The total absence of a free press meant that human rights abuses went uninvestigated and unreported by domestic media, leaving victims and their families with no legal recourse or public voice. By the end of the 1980s, the colonel who ruled without a crown had successfully institutionalized his personal authority to an extent rarely seen in the modern world. The Jamahiriya had evolved from an idealistic experiment in direct popular rule into a deeply entrenched, highly personalized autocracy sustained by oil wealth, pervasive surveillance, ideological indoctrination, and ruthless internal security. The revolutionary committees and intelligence agencies ensured that the regime remained secure against internal challenges. But this absolute control came at a tremendous cost to social trust, institutional development, and national unity. Libya was entirely bound to the vision and survival of one man, setting the stage for decades of complex internal tensions and setting up a dramatic reckoning when the foundations of his absolute power would finally be tested by history. The massive wealth generated by petroleum exports fundamentally reshaped the social fabric, infrastructure, and economic landscape of Libya during the decades of Muammar Gaddafi's rule. Before the 1969 revolution, Libya had been one of the poorest nations in the world, relying heavily on foreign aid, agriculture, and scrap metal left over from World War II battlefields. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the late 1950s and 1960s changed this reality completely. Once Gaddafi and the Revolutionary Command Council consolidated power, one of their primary and most popular objectives was to seize control of the national oil industry from foreign multinational corporations. By renegotiating concession agreements, increasing tax rates, and eventually nationalizing major oil assets, the revolutionary government ensured that a vastly higher share of petroleum revenues flowed directly into state coffers. This influx of unprecedented wealth presented the new regime with a monumental opportunity. Gaddafi envisioned a transformation of Libyan society that would eradicate poverty, modernize the nation's infrastructure, and elevate the standard of living for every ordinary citizen. Flush with billions of petrodollars, the state embarked on an ambitious series of modernization projects, public works programs, and social reforms. Mud brick settlements and impoverished shanty towns that had long characterized the rural peripheries and outskirts of major cities were targeted for systematic replacement. Modern concrete apartment blocks, equipped with running water, electricity, and basic sanitation, were constructed in urban centers and regional towns across the country, providing free or heavily subsidized housing to thousands of families who had previously lived in substandard conditions. The restructuring of the economy was matched by sweeping investments in human capital, particularly through the expansion of public education and healthcare. Under the monarchy, literacy rates had been dismally low, and access to secondary and higher education was restricted to a privileged few. The revolutionary government made education a top priority, building hundreds of new schools, training institutes, and universities across the nation. Education was made completely free at all levels, and attending school became compulsory for children. As a result, literacy rates among the younger generation climbed dramatically within a single decade. Thousands of young Libyans were also sent abroad on government scholarships to study engineering, medicine, and technical sciences at universities in Europe and North America, with the expectation that they would return to build the modern infrastructure of the Jamahiriya. Simultaneously, the healthcare sector experienced a massive transformation. Modern hospitals, specialized clinics, and rural health centers were established in virtually every district, ensuring that even remote desert communities had access to basic medical services. Healthcare was declared a fundamental right for all citizens and provided entirely free of charge. To staff these new facilities, the Libyan government recruited thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical specialists from friendly nations, particularly across the Arab world and Eastern Europe, bridging the severe shortage of domestic medical professionals, while the country's own educational institutions worked to train the next generation of Libyan physicians and healthcare workers. Infrastructure development became another visible hallmark of the Libyan economic experiment. Paved highways were constructed to connect isolated towns across vast desert expanses, linking the coastal hubs of Tripoli and Benghazi with southern regions like Fezzan and the oil fields of the interior. Ports were expanded, electrical grids were modernized and extended to rural areas, and international airports were built to integrate Libya more closely with the global community. Perhaps the most monumental and ambitious engineering feat of this era was the Great Man-Made River Project, launched in the 1980s. This colossal undertaking was designed to tap massive underground fossil water aquifers deep beneath the Sahara Desert and transport millions of cubic meters of fresh water through massive underground pipelines to the densely populated coastal plains for drinking and agricultural irrigation. Yet, despite these undeniable achievements in infrastructure, housing, and social services, the Libyan economic model harbored deep structural flaws and systemic vulnerabilities. The massive inflow of oil revenues created a classic rentier-state economy, wherein the government derived the vast majority of its income from a single commodity rather than from taxation or productive domestic labor. This dynamic discouraged the development of a diversified, self-sustaining private sector. Agriculture, manufacturing, and traditional industries were largely neglected or smothered by inefficient state bureaucracies. Instead of fostering an environment where independent businesses could thrive, the state became the universal provider, employer, and economic coordinator of society, creating a culture of dependency on state patronage. Economic mismanagement and bureaucratic inefficiency frequently plagued major state projects. Billions of dollars were poured into grandiose industrial schemes and utopian agricultural projects that were often ill-conceived, poorly managed, or unsuited to Libya's arid environment. Massive state-run supermarkets and distribution centers were established to replace private retail, leading to chronic shortages of basic goods, long queues, and widespread frustration among consumers. Price controls, currency restrictions, and unpredictable regulatory shifts further stifled economic initiative. Whenever oil prices on the international market experienced a downturn, the Libyan economy felt the immediate shock, forcing the government to abruptly scale back public spending and delay ambitious development projects. Corruption and nepotism, though officially condemned by the revolutionary ideology, became entrenched within the administration of state resources. While ordinary citizens benefited from subsidized bread, fuel, electricity, and housing, wealth and privilege were increasingly skewed toward those with close ties to the revolutionary committees, military leadership, and the ruling elite. Public funds were frequently diverted to finance foreign interventions, extravagant vanity projects, or the personal whims of the regime rather than being reinvested into sustainable economic diversification. The lack of transparency and financial accountability meant that there was no independent mechanism to audit state spending or expose systemic waste. By the late 1980s, the limits of the Libyan economic experiment had become starkly apparent. While the country's social indicators, such as literacy, life expectancy, and basic standard of living, had improved immensely compared to the pre-revolutionary era, the economy remained dangerously vulnerable. It was entirely dependent on the export of crude oil to foreign markets and tightly managed by a centralized bureaucracy that stifled private entrepreneurship and market innovation. The wealth that had promised to turn Libya into a modern, prosperous socialist paradise had instead created a fragile, highly centralized economic structure. This structure relied heavily on continuous petroleum windfalls to maintain public loyalty, setting the stage for severe economic crises when international sanctions and shifting global oil markets would later challenge the foundations of the Jamahiriya. As the Libyan state grew wealthy and confident from its rising petroleum exports, Muammar Gaddafi turned his immense energy outward, determined to make his voice heard far beyond the borders of North Africa. He did not see himself merely as the leader of a desert nation, but as a global revolutionary pioneer destined to challenge the existing world order. In his eyes, the globe was divided into an unjust hierarchy dominated by imperialist powers like the United States and major European nations, which exploited the developing world while preaching democracy and freedom. Gaddafi believed that Libya, armed with revolutionary ideology and abundant oil wealth, had a moral duty to lead the resistance against Western hegemony, fight for the rights of oppressed peoples, and champion the unification of the Arab and African worlds. From the very beginning of his rule, Gaddafi's foreign policy was defined by an uncompromising hostility toward Western colonialism and neocolonialism. He wasted no time dismantling the remnants of foreign military influence within Libya. Shortly after seizing power in 1969, he successfully pressured the United States and Great Britain to evacuate their strategic military installations, such as Wheelus Air Base near Tripoli, which had long served as a symbol of foreign dominance. With the foreign troops gone, Gaddafi began channeling substantial Libyan resources into supporting anti-colonial liberation movements across the globe. He provided financial backing, military training, and ideological literature to guerrilla groups, revolutionary factions, and independence movements fighting against white minority rule in southern Africa, colonial control in various parts of the globe, and authoritarian regimes aligned with Western interests. His vision of Arab unity, heavily inspired by the pan-Arab ideals of Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, became a central pillar of his early foreign policy. Gaddafi genuinely believed that the Arab world was a single nation artificially divided by colonial borders, and he repeatedly proposed sweeping political unions with neighboring countries. Over the years, he attempted various unification schemes with Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Chad, and Malta. These grand proposals, however, were frequently plagued by mutual suspicion, deep political rivalries, and stark differences in governance style. Gaddafi's impatient, uncompromising approach to leadership often alienated his fellow Arab heads of state. When Egyptian President Anwar Sadat pursued a peace treaty with Israel in the late 1970s, Gaddafi bitterly denounced the agreement, leading to a complete diplomatic rupture between Tripoli and Cairo, and leaving Libya increasingly isolated within the traditional Arab political mainstream. Frustrated by the frequent deadlocks and conservative hesitation of Middle Eastern politics, Gaddafi gradually shifted his strategic vision southward toward the African continent. He began casting himself as the champion of African liberation and continental integration, pouring millions of dollars into development projects, infrastructure investments, and mediation efforts across sub-Saharan Africa. He funded schools, hospitals, and agricultural initiatives in impoverished nations, building a complex network of political alliances. His ultimate ambition culminated in the early 2000s when he became one of the primary driving forces behind the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union. He passionately advocated for the creation of a United States of Africa, complete with a single continental currency, a unified military force, and a central government. While many African leaders accepted Libyan financial aid and diplomatic support, few were willing to surrender their national sovereignty to Gaddafi's utopian vision, leaving his grand Pan-African dreams largely unfulfilled. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's confrontational stance toward the West brought Libya into repeated cycles of acute geopolitical crisis. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Washington and its European allies viewed the Libyan leader as a dangerous rogue actor and a primary sponsor of international subversion. Gaddafi openly mocked Western leaders, gave fiery speeches denouncing capitalism, and maintained open hostility toward American foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The United States government, under successive administrations, accused Tripoli of orchestrating terrorist attacks, funding radical militant organizations across multiple continents, and attempting to destabilize pro-Western governments in Africa and the Middle East. Tensions reached a dramatic boiling point in the mid-1980s under the administration of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Following a series of violent incidents attributed to Libyan-backed operatives, including a deadly bombing at a Berlin discotheque frequented by American servicemen, the United States decided to take direct military action. In April 1986, American warplanes launched Operation El Dorado Canyon, executing precision air strikes against military targets, command centers, and residential compounds in Tripoli and Benghazi. The bombing raid resulted in significant material damage and the loss of dozens of lives, including members of Gaddafi's own household. The attack left a deep psychological scar on the Libyan leadership and civilian population, cementing a narrative of siege and defiance that Gaddafi would exploit for years to come. Rather than subduing him, the 1986 airstrikes only deepened Gaddafi's defiant rhetoric and his determination to project power globally, regardless of the mounting economic and diplomatic costs. He continued to pursue unorthodox foreign ventures, maintained close ties with various armed groups, and sought unconventional diplomatic allies in both the Eastern Bloc and the non-aligned movement. Yet, this relentless pursuit of global revolutionary influence isolated Libya from the international financial system and set the stage for even more severe diplomatic storms. As the decade drew to a close, the cumulative weight of Gaddafi's confrontational foreign policy, combined with allegations of covert operations against international aviation, drew the attention of global law enforcement agencies, pulling Libya toward a profound international showdown that would test the very survival of his regime. As the final decade of the 20th century approached, Muammar Gaddafi's uncompromising defiance of the West and his continuous sponsorship of overseas militant factions pulled Libya into a profound international crisis. Despite the heavy psychological and physical toll of the 1986 American airstrikes, the Libyan leader refused to alter his foreign policy course, maintaining a posture of fierce resistance against Washington and its European allies. This persistent confrontation soon intersected with global aviation investigations, setting the stage for a tragedy that would isolate Libya from the rest of the world more severely than ever before. The pivotal turning point occurred on December 21, 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the quiet Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing all 259 passengers and crew on board, along with 11 residents on the ground. The disaster immediately triggered an intensive, multi-year joint investigation led by American and British intelligence and law enforcement agencies. As forensic evidence was pieced together from thousands of scattered fragments, investigators traced the detonator mechanism and timing devices back to components allegedly sold to Libyan intelligence. By the early 1990s, formal indictments were issued against two Libyan intelligence operatives, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and al-Amin Khalifa Fhimma, accusing them of planting the explosive device. When the United States and Great Britain formally demanded that Tripoli surrender the two suspects to stand trial in a Western court, Muammar Gaddafi flatly refused. He argued that an impartial trial could not be guaranteed in Western jurisdictions and maintained that Libya was being unfairly targeted by a hostile international conspiracy. Rather than handing over the men, Gaddafi sought alternative legal compromises, suggesting they be tried in a neutral country or by an international tribunal. Western governments rejected these proposals, viewing them as delaying tactics designed to shield state-backed terrorism from accountability. The refusal to extradite the suspects prompted the United Nations Security Council to take unprecedented punitive action against a North African nation. In March 1992, the UN adopted Resolution 748, imposing sweeping international sanctions on Libya. These measures included a comprehensive arms embargo, a ban on all international commercial flights in and out of Libyan airspace, and restrictions on the diplomatic representation of Libyan missions abroad. Furthermore, nations were instructed to restrict the processing of certain Libyan financial assets. A year later, in 1993, the Security Council intensified the measures with Resolution 883, freezing overseas Libyan bank accounts and prohibiting the export of essential oil production and refining equipment to the country. The impact of these multilateral sanctions, combined with existing unilateral American trade bans, gradually exerted a heavy toll on the Libyan economy and society. For a nation whose entire modern development and standard of living relied heavily on petroleum exports and foreign industrial machinery, the restriction on oil technology began to degrade critical infrastructure. Modernization projects slowed, unemployment rose, and imported goods became scarce or prohibitively expensive. Essential medical supplies, spare parts for commercial aircraft, and oilfield equipment grew increasingly difficult to acquire, frustrating ordinary citizens who bore the brunt of their leaders' geopolitical standoffs. Internally, the shadow of the Lockerbie controversy and the ensuing isolation caused subtle shifts within Libyan society. Gaddafi utilized state-controlled media to channel public frustration outward, framing the UN sanctions as an unjust imperialist assault designed to starve and subjugate the Libyan people. Rallies and demonstrations were orchestrated across Tripoli and Benghazi, where citizens chanted slogans of defiance against the United Nations and Western powers. Yet, behind the public displays of revolutionary solidarity, economic fatigue was setting in. The state could no longer distribute wealth as generously as it had during the oil boom decades, and the cracks in the revolutionary model began to widen. Throughout the 1990s, Libya remained locked in a diplomatic deep freeze. International air travel isolation meant that anyone entering or leaving the country had to travel by sea or take lengthy overland routes through neighboring Tunisia or Egypt, cutting off vital professional and personal exchanges with the global community. Diplomatically, Tripoli was treated as a pariah state by Western capitals, though Gaddafi maintained limited ties with various non-aligned nations, African states, and regional figures willing to bypass or critique Western hegemony. As the decade progressed, the heavy cost of international isolation became increasingly unsustainable for a regime trying to secure its long-term survival. The Lockerbie shadow hung over every aspect of Libyan foreign policy, blocking any chance of economic rehabilitation or global reintegration. By the close of the 1990s, subtle back-channel negotiations involving international mediators, regional leaders, and legal experts began exploring paths toward a compromise. The realization that Libya's revolutionary isolation was extracting too high a price ultimately forced a reluctant internal reassessment, preparing the ground for a dramatic diplomatic about-face as the new millennium approached. As the calendar turned toward the new millennium, the political landscape surrounding Muammar Gaddafi's Libya stood at a profound and unexpected crossroads. For more than a decade, the country had endured the suffocating weight of international isolation, economic sanctions, and diplomatic ostracism stemming from the 1988 Lockerbie disaster and various overseas conflicts. The financial toll on Libya's oil infrastructure, combined with a growing weariness among ordinary citizens who desired reconnection with the global community, created an urgent imperative for change. Behind closed doors, senior Libyan officials, intelligence intermediaries, and international diplomats began laying the groundwork for what would become known as the Great Reconciliation, a stunning strategic realignment that would fundamentally alter Libya's relationship with the West and bring the long-standing desert state back into the diplomatic fold. The first major breakthrough in breaking the diplomatic stalemate arrived through protracted legal negotiations regarding the Lockerbie bombing suspects. For years, Muammar Gaddafi had adamantly refused to surrender Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Al-Amin Khalifa, Fhimma, to American or British courts, demanding a neutral trial venue. The diplomatic logjam finally began to clear in the late 1990s through mediation efforts led by figures such as South African President Nelson Mandela and former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan. A compromise was eventually struck to hold the trial under Scottish law, but convened in a neutral third country, the Netherlands. In April 1999, the two Libyan suspects were transferred to Camp Zeist in Utrecht, allowing the long-delayed legal proceedings to finally commence. Though the trial later resulted in the conviction of al-Megrahi and the acquittal of Fhimma, the successful handover removed the primary legal obstacle that had triggered the United Nations Security Council sanctions a decade earlier. Following the transfer of the suspects to the Netherlands, the United Nations formally suspended its sanctions against Libya in April 1999. This suspension marked an immediate turning point for the North African nation, reopening its airspace to international commercial aviation and allowing foreign business delegations, engineers, and diplomats to return to Tripoli. For the average Libyan citizen, the reopening of the skies represented a powerful psychological liberation from years of travel restrictions and economic strangulation. International airlines began landing at Tripoli International Airport once again, reconnecting families, businesses, and government officials with Europe, Africa, and the wider world. Foreign oil corporations, which had watched from the sidelines during the embargo years, eagerly returned to negotiate new contracts for developing Libya's massive petroleum reserves, sensing that a new era of commercial opportunity was dawning. Yet, Muammar Gaddafi's grand reconciliation strategy extended far beyond resolving the Lockerbie crisis. It encompassed a radical transformation of Libya's security posture and proliferation policies. In the wake of the September 11 attacks in the United States and the subsequent American-led military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Libyan leadership grew increasingly anxious about its own security vulnerabilities. Gaddafi and his closest advisors, particularly his son Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, recognized that maintaining clandestine weapons programs could make Libya a prime target for Western military action. Secret back-channel negotiations between Libyan intelligence officials and representatives from the United States and Great Britain intensified throughout 2002 and 2003, focusing on a comprehensive dismantling of Libya's unconventional military capabilities. In a stunning diplomatic announcement in December 2003, Muammar Gaddafi shocked the international community by publicly declaring that Libya would voluntarily abandon all of its programs for developing weapons of mass destruction. In coordination with American, British, and International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, the Libyan government began dismantling its clandestine nuclear enrichment infrastructure, surrendering chemical weapon stockpiles, and turning over technical documents and equipment. Specialized cargo flights transported tons of sensitive materials, centrifuge parts, and missile components out of Libya to secure facilities abroad. This unprecedented decision was hailed by Western leaders as a major diplomatic victory for nonproliferation, instantly transforming Libya from a pariah state into a cooperative partner in the global fight against terrorism and weapons proliferation. The dramatic elimination of Libya's weapons programs cleared the path for a rapid and extraordinary normalization of diplomatic ties with Western governments. During the course of 2004, British Prime Minister Tony Blair traveled to Tripoli, meeting with Muammar Gaddafi in a Bedouin tent outside the capital to formally welcome Libya back into the international community. European leaders, eager to secure energy supplies and commercial contracts, lined up to visit Tripoli, while the United States gradually lifted its remaining unilateral trade sanctions, removed Libya from its list of state sponsors of terrorism, and re-established full diplomatic relations. Ambassadors exchanged credentials, economic partnerships flourished, and Libyan intelligence services began cooperating closely with Western intelligence agencies in tracking international militant networks. For Muammar Gaddafi, the successful reconciliation effort allowed him to step onto the global diplomatic stage with renewed confidence and theatrical flair. Shedding his earlier image as an isolated revolutionary outcast, he embarked on high-profile state visits to European capitals, pitching his distinctive Bedouin tent outside historic palaces in Rome, Paris, and Brussels. In 2009, Gaddafi achieved a historic milestone when he was elected chairperson of the African Union, taking center stage at United Nations General Assembly sessions in New York, where he delivered rambling, theatrical addresses to world leaders. To the outside observer, it appeared that the aging colonel had successfully reinvented himself as a respected statesman and elder leader of the African continent. Beneath the surface of diplomatic banquets and lucrative oil deals, however, the Great Reconciliation left complex and contradictory internal ripples within Libya. While the lifting of sanctions brought an influx of foreign investment, modern consumer goods, and economic growth, the benefits were unevenly distributed, exacerbating existing disparities between the elite and ordinary citizens. Many traditional revolutionary ideologues within the regime viewed the warm embrace of Western capitalist powers as a betrayal of the 1969 revolution's core anti-imperialist principles. Yet, Gaddafi maintained firm control over the political apparatus, balancing his new alliances with Western governments against his revolutionary rhetoric. As the first decade of the 21st century drew to a close, Libya seemed secure on the surface, integrated into the global economy, and courted by global superpowers who overlooked past grievances in favor of oil and counter-terrorism cooperation. The Great Reconciliation had successfully rescued the regime from the economic ruin of international isolation, preserving Gaddafi's rule and projecting an image of enduring stability. Yet, this diplomatic triumph masked deep-seated domestic grievances, underlying political stagnation, and suppressed social tensions that would soon erupt when the revolutionary winds of the Arab Spring reached North Africa's shores, testing the durability of Gaddafi's restructured world. The year 2011 began with a quiet sense of routine across North Africa, but beneath the surface of the region, tectonic plates were shifting. For decades, the political landscape had appeared frozen in place, dominated by entrenched leaders who had ruled for generations under varying shades of authoritarianism. Yet, the accumulated pressures of youth unemployment, soaring food prices, widespread political corruption, and the stifling denial of basic freedoms had created a volatile powder keg. All it required was a single spark to ignite an unprecedented wave of popular anger. That spark was struck in December 2010 in the small central Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid, where a young street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi, driven to despair by police harassment and the confiscation of his meager livelihood, set himself on fire. His desperate act resonated instantly across Tunisia, triggering a massive wave of street protests that defied the heavy hand of the state. Within weeks, the pressure became insurmountable, forcing long-time Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to flee the country on January 14, 2011. The fall of the Tunisian regime sent shockwaves throughout the Arab world. Ordinary citizens in neighboring countries watched in astonishment as peaceful demonstrators successfully toppled a dictator who had seemed invincible. The psychological barrier of fear was broken. The momentum of what would come to be known as the Arab Spring quickly crossed borders, jumping from Tunisia into Egypt, where millions took to Tahrir Square in Cairo to demand the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak. By mid-February, after weeks of intense mass mobilizations, Mubarak too was forced to step down, proving that collective public action could redraw the political map of the Middle East and North Africa. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi and his inner circle watched these neighboring revolutions with a mixture of disbelief, denial, and mounting anxiety. For more than 40 years, the Libyan leader had positioned himself as a unique visionary philosopher, confident that his Jamahiriya system of direct popular rule protected him from the deep public grievances affecting other Arab nations. Official state media in Tripoli initially downplayed the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, framing them as temporary disturbances and praising the fallen leaders or criticizing the protesters. Privately, however, the regime recognized the profound danger posed by the unfolding events. Security apparatuses across the country were placed on heightened alert, and intelligence officials monitored local communications closely to preempt any sign of domestic sympathy or organization. Despite the regime's efforts to insulate Libya from the regional contagion, the revolutionary spirit proved impossible to quarantine. The first tremors of dissent began to appear in eastern Libya, specifically in the historic and independent-minded city of Benghazi. Benghazi had long harbored deep-seated grievances against the central government in Tripoli. Decades of economic marginalization, intentional underdevelopment of the East, memories of past political purges, and a general weariness of Gaddafi's personal rule created an explosive environment. Small acts of defiance, such as graffiti calling for freedom and the distribution of leaflets inspired by the events in Tunisia and Egypt, began to appear on university campuses and street walls. The immediate trigger for the Libyan uprising arrived in mid-February 2011, centered around human rights lawyer and activist Fathi Tarbal. Tarbal had been representing the families of hundreds of inmates who had been killed during the notorious 1996 massacre at Abu Salam prison in Tripoli. His arbitrary arrest by security forces on February 15 served as the catalyst that Benghazi had been waiting for. Families of the victims, joined by students, lawyers, and ordinary citizens, gathered outside the internal security headquarters in Benghazi to demand his immediate release. What started as a peaceful demonstration quickly swelled into a massive gathering as security forces responded with tear gas and live ammunition, resulting in the deaths of several protesters. The spilling of blood in Benghazi did not quell the dissent. Instead, it galvanized the population into open rebellion. Enraged by the violence, thousands of citizens poured into the streets the following day, confronting security forces with bare hands and overwhelming police stations. Government buildings, symbols of state control, and police headquarters were targeted by angry crowds. By February 17, which would later be commemorated as the official start of the revolution, the protests had evolved into a full-scale uprising. Demonstrators took over public squares, tore down green flags, and burned portraits of Muammar Gaddafi that had looked down on Libyan cities for over 4 decades. The government's response to the escalating crisis was swift, uncompromising, and brutally repressive. Muammar Gaddafi and his son Saif al-Islam appeared on state television to deliver defiant addresses, framing the protesters not as legitimate citizens with grievances, but as drug-addled criminals, foreign mercenaries, and al-Qaeda extremists bent on destroying the unity of the Libyan state. Gaddafi vowed to hunt down the dissenters house by house, alley by alley, and room by room, urging his loyalist security forces and revolutionary committees to cleanse the country. Acting on these directives, elite military units, security brigades commanded by Gaddafi's sons, and foreign mercenaries deployed heavy weaponry, anti-aircraft guns, and artillery against unarmed civilian demonstrators in Benghazi, Tripoli, and other major urban centers. The extreme violence used by the state shocked the international community and caused immediate fractures within the Libyan government itself. Recognizing the moral bankruptcy of firing upon their own people, prominent political and military figures began to break ranks with the regime. Justice Minister Mustafa Abdul Jalil resigned in protest against the excessive violence, signaling a major crack in the regime's facade. Simultaneously, military units stationed in the east, led by officers who chose to side with the civilian population rather than fire upon them, mutinied and joined the uprising. Air Force pilots ordered to bomb civilian protesters in Benghazi chose instead to eject or fly their fighter jets to neighboring Malta, refusing to execute orders against their fellow citizens. By late February, the nature of the crisis had transformed irrevocably from political unrest into an armed civil war. The eastern half of Libya, anchored by Benghazi, al-Baida, and Tobruk, slipped entirely out of government control. Local volunteers, defected soldiers, and armed citizens organized themselves into impromptu militias, seizing military barracks, armories, and checkpoints left abandoned by fleeing loyalist forces. Weapons caches were distributed to the populace, and a makeshift command structure began to take shape under the banner of the newly formed Transitional National Council, which sought to present itself as the legitimate political voice of the anti-Gaddafi movement. As the uprising gained territory in the east, the conflict began to surge westward toward the capital of Tripoli. Rebel forces, poorly trained and lightly armed but fueled by revolutionary fervor, launched an advance along the coastal highway, capturing towns and oil installations as they moved. However, as they approached cities closer to Tripoli, such as Misrata and Zawiya, they encountered fierce resistance from well-equipped loyalist brigades. The regime launched counteroffensives utilizing tanks, artillery, and airstrikes, pushing the front lines back and forth across the desert landscape. Urban areas became flashpoints of brutal house-to-house fighting, and civilian populations endured severe shortages of food, medical supplies, and fuel as the infrastructure of the country began to fracture under the weight of war. The rapid descent of Libya into civil war created a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions. Hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, who had formed the backbone of Libya's labor force, fled across the borders into Egypt and Tunisia, joining thousands of Libyan refugees seeking safety from the violence. International borders swelled with desperate people living in temporary tent camps, waiting for repatriation flights or humanitarian assistance. Inside Libya, hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians and combatants, lacking basic surgical supplies, anesthetic, and blood plasma. The economic engine of the country, its vast oil production facilities, ground to a halt or became battlegrounds, cutting off the vital revenues that had sustained the Libyan state for decades. For Muammar Gaddafi, the events of early 2011 represented the ultimate existential crisis of his long reign. Having survived 4 decades of coup attempts, foreign sanctions, economic embargoes, and military confrontations with global powers, he now faced an internal rebellion that threatened to dismantle his life's work. Convinced of his own righteousness and historical destiny, He refused to contemplate stepping down, viewing any compromise as treason against his revolution. He mobilized every remaining loyalist resource, relying on family members, trusted tribal networks, and heavy military hardware to hold the western half of the country and defend his stronghold in Tripoli. Yet, the domestic landscape was no longer insulated from the outside world. The images of burning buildings, defiant crowds, and brutal crackdowns broadcast on international news networks and social media platforms created immense public pressure on Western governments to intervene. The Arab Spring had unlocked a Pandora's box in North Africa, and Libya was now at the eye of the storm. The local uprising, born out of solidarity with Tunisia and Egypt, had rapidly escalated into a ferocious civil war that was redrawing the boundaries of loyalty and power. As Gaddafi's tanks rolled toward Benghazi in mid-March with the explicit threat of a merciless crackdown on the population, the international community stood at a critical precipice, preparing to take actions that would draw foreign military might directly into the heart of the Libyan conflict. As March 2011 unfolded, the humanitarian and political crisis inside Libya reached a terrifying tipping point. Muammar Gaddafi's military machine, fueled by heavy armor, artillery, and fighter jets, had successfully halted the initial rebel advance and launched a powerful counteroffensive. Loyalist forces rolled eastward along the coastal highway, crushing resistance in towns and cities that had briefly tasted freedom. By mid-March, Gaddafi's tanks were rumbling toward the outskirts of Benghazi, the vital capital of the opposition and the symbolic heart of the February 17 uprising. From state television in Tripoli, Gaddafi broadcast a chilling warning to the city's residents. He announced that his armed forces were coming that very night, that there would be no mercy, and that anyone found with weapons would be hunted down without quarter. For the hundreds of thousands of anti-Gaddafi protesters and civilians sheltering in Benghazi, the threat of an imminent massacre felt absolute and unavoidable. Faced with the impending slaughter of civilians, the international community could no longer watch from the sidelines. The United Nations Security Council, which had already condemned the regime's brutal use of force and imposed targeted sanctions, moved with unusual speed and urgency to confront the unfolding catastrophe. On March 17, 2011, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1973. The vote authorized member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack in Libya. Crucially, the resolution also established a no-fly zone across the entire Libyan airspace, banning all flights to prevent the regime's air force from bombing rebel positions and civilian neighborhoods. This historic resolution transformed the domestic civil war into a major international conflict, drawing a direct line between the local uprising and the military might of global powers. Just days after the passage of the UN resolution, the military response began. On the evening of March 19, French fighter jets streaked across the Mediterranean skies and struck military targets inside Libya, halting a loyalist armored column that was closing in on Benghazi. Within hours, United States and British naval forces joined the operation, unleashing volleys of Tomahawk cruise missiles against Libyan air defense radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, and command centers along the coast. The operation, initially dubbed Operation Odyssey, Dawn by the United States, and later transitioned into the NATO-led mission Operation Unified Protector, aimed to neutralize Gaddafi's military capabilities and enforce the no-fly zone. For the residents of Benghazi, the distant thunder of explosions and the streaks of anti-aircraft tracer fire across the night sky signaled a miraculous reprieve. The loyalist tanks parked on the city's southwestern approaches were battered and forced to retreat, saving the city from a catastrophic urban battle. Yet, the arrival of foreign air power did not instantly resolve the conflict or bring a swift end to the civil war. Instead, it created a volatile stalemate across the shifting desert front lines. Gaddafi's forces quickly adapted to the threat from the skies. Abandoning heavy tanks and large military convoys that made easy targets for coalition warplanes, loyalist troops disguised their military vehicles, painted them to blend in with civilian traffic, and adopted guerrilla-style tactics. They utilized civilian pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns and deployed infantry inside residential areas, effectively using human shields to deter airstrikes. As a result, the conflict devolved into a back-and-forth war of movement across the coastal desert highway, particularly around the strategic oil towns of Ajdabia, Brega, and Ras Lanuf. On the ground, the anti-Gaddafi forces, organized loosely as the Transitional National Council Army, struggled to capitalize on the protection provided by coalition airstrikes. Composed largely of defected soldiers, students, professionals, and young volunteers, the rebel army possessed immense enthusiasm and courage, but suffered from a crippling lack of military discipline, tactical coordination, and heavy weaponry. Time and again, rebel fighters would surge westward in chaotic convoys of civilian vehicles, cheering and firing weapons into the air, only to be ambushed, outmaneuvered, and brutally repelled whenever loyalist forces managed to draw them into well-planned artillery traps. The front lines swung back and forth across hundreds of kilometers of barren desert terrain, demonstrating that Western air power alone could not easily build an effective ground army or secure a definitive victory for the rebellion. The human cost of this prolonged military stalemate fell heavily upon the civilian populations trapped inside contested cities, most notably the coastal city of Misrata. Located about 200 kilometers east of Tripoli, Misrata was the only major urban center in western Libya that had successfully risen against the regime. Surrounded by hostile loyalist forces, the city was besieged for weeks, enduring relentless artillery bombardments, sniper fire, and naval blockades. Despite being cut off from supplies, the residents and local fighters dug in, turning schools, mosques, and homes into makeshift hospitals and defensive positions. The heroic defense of Misrata became a powerful symbol of the revolution's resilience, even as hospitals overflowed with casualties and basic necessities like water, food, and electricity dwindled to critical levels. As the weeks of spring turned into summer, the nature of the international intervention evolved. In late March, NATO officially assumed full command and control of the military operations in Libya, coordinating the enforcement of the arms embargo, the no-fly zone, and the protection of civilians through precision airstrikes. While NATO mandate was strictly limited to civilian protection rather than regime change, the systematic destruction of Gaddafi's military infrastructure steadily degraded the regime's capacity to wage war. Loyalist supply lines were severed, command bunkers were reduced to rubble, and major ammunition depots were destroyed. The balance of power, which had heavily favored the regime in February, began a slow but unmistakable shift toward the opposition. Diplomatically, the regime found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage. Major Western nations and a growing number of Arab states formally recognized the Transitional National Council, based in Benghazi, as the legitimate representative of the Libyan people, unlocking frozen financial assets to help the opposition sustain its administration. Gaddafi, defiant to the core, continued to rail against what he termed Western imperialism and crusader aggression, broadcasting rambling audio messages over state radio and vowing that the Libyan people would fight to the last man. Yet, his inner circle began to experience internal fractures and high-profile defections. Senior ministers, diplomats, and military generals slipped across the border into Tunisia or Europe, realizing that the regime's survival was no longer a certainty. By midsummer 2011, the military campaign had settled into an intense war of attrition. While the East remained firmly in rebel hands and Misrata held out against relentless assaults, the Western front lines remained deadlocked in the desert heat. NATO warplanes maintained a relentless daily patrol, striking any loyalist troop concentrations or heavy artillery pieces that threatened civilian areas. The conflict had become a brutal endurance test, pitting the sheer staying power of Gaddafi's remaining loyalist brigades against the combined pressure of international military intervention and a determined domestic rebellion. The world watched as the once imposing regime of the Desert King was systematically cornered, paving the way for the final, dramatic chapters of the Libyan civil war. As the hot summer months of 2011 wore on, the stalemate that had gripped Libya for months began to crack under the relentless pressure of the ongoing NATO air campaign and the growing organization of the rebel forces. The country was deeply fractured, economically exhausted, and physically battered by a conflict that had already lasted half a year. Yet, beneath the surface of the apparent military deadlock, the foundations of Muammar Gaddafi's four-decade-long regime were quietly crumbling away. The loyalist forces, once a formidable and terrifying instrument of state control, were starved of fuel, running low on ammunition, and thoroughly demoralized by continuous aerial bombardment. Their supply lines, stretching from the western border down through the coastal highway, had been systematically severed by coalition warplanes. Inside Tripoli, the atmosphere had shifted from one of defiant confidence to a heavy, suffocating tension. Ordinary citizens endured daily power outages, severe shortages of fuel and food, and the constant, unnerving roar of fighter jets breaking the sound barrier overhead. Checkpoints manned by nervous security forces and armed loyalist militias multiplied on every corner, searching cars and watching the civilian population with mounting paranoia. The regime was running out of time, money, and international allies, and the final, decisive confrontation for the capital was rapidly approaching. The spark that ignited the final phase of the civil war came not from a massive frontal assault by the rebel army in the east, but rather from a carefully coordinated uprising within the western mountains and the coastal towns surrounding Tripoli. For months, opposition cells had operated underground inside the capital and neighboring regions, smuggling weapons, organizing safe houses, and maintaining secret communication channels with the Transitional National Council. By mid-August, these clandestine networks judged that the moment for action had finally arrived. On the night of August 20, 2011, as Muslims broke their Ramadan fast, a pre-planned insurrection erupted across several neighborhoods of Tripoli. Mosque loudspeakers, normally used for calls to prayer, began broadcasting calls for revolt, urging residents to take to the streets and throw off the chains of the regime. Thousands of young men poured out of their homes, shouting anti-regime slogans, tearing down green flags, and erecting barricades of burning tires and sheet metal to block loyalist reinforcements. The sudden eruption of internal rebellion caught the regime's security apparatus completely off guard, splitting their attention between defending the outer perimeter and trying to suppress open insurrection within the city center itself. Simultaneously, the main rebel forces launched a sweeping, multi-pronged offensive from their positions in the western mountains, racing down toward the coastal plain in what would become known as Operation Mermaid Dawn. Fighters from the Nafusa Mountains, alongside volunteers from coastal towns like Zawiya and Serman, advanced with astonishing speed, overrunning remaining loyalist outposts and sweeping through towns that had long chafed under government control. Unlike the chaotic and ill-fated advances of the spring, this offensive was executed with surprising tactical coordination and benefited immensely from close radio and air support coordination with NATO forces. As rebel columns advanced along the highway toward Tripoli, they were greeted by cheering crowds of local residents who waved the tricolor independence flag and rushed out to offer food, water, and intelligence on loyalist troop movements. The psychological momentum had completely inverted. The fear that had kept the population cowed for decades evaporated overnight, replaced by an overwhelming sense of liberation and an unstoppable collective drive to see the regime fall once and for all. As the rebel fighters and local insurgents converged on the capital from the west, south, and east, the defenses of the regime collapsed with shocking swiftness. Loyalist military units, facing overwhelming domestic opposition and relentless airstrikes, either melted away, discarded their uniforms to blend into the civilian population, or surrendered en masse to the advancing opposition forces. By August 21, rebel units had broken through the western gates of Tripoli and were streaming into the city streets aboard pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, firing celebratory shots into the night sky. Crowds of ecstatic citizens rushed to greet them, embracing fighters, waving flags, and tearing down towering billboards of Muammar Gaddafi and copies of his Green Book. Government offices, state security headquarters, and military barracks were abandoned or overrun by jubilant crowds, who reveled in the sudden, dizzying collapse of an apparatus of control that had dominated every aspect of Libyan life for over 40 years. The symbolic heart of the capital, Green Square, promptly renamed Martyrs Square by the jubilant populace, became a massive ocean of humanity, celebrating a victory that many had thought impossible just months prior. Amidst the chaos of the city's fall, the physical centers of the regime's absolute power were systematically dismantled. The most prominent among these was the Bab al-Azizia compound, a sprawling, heavily fortified military barracks and residential complex in southern Tripoli that had served as Gaddafi's ultimate stronghold and the nerve center of his authoritarian rule for decades. For years, the compound had been a forbidden city to ordinary Libyans, surrounded by high blast walls, watchtowers, and elite security units. On August 23, after days of fierce artillery exchanges and heavy fighting around its perimeter, rebel fighters finally breached the massive iron gates of Bab al-Azizia and swarmed inside. They encountered little organized resistance from the remaining guards. Instead of finding a resolute garrison, the rebels discovered an eerie, surreal landscape of underground bunkers, private luxury living quarters, lavish reception halls, and bizarre personal touches, including a private amusement park and a monument shaped like a golden fist crushing a U.S. warplane. Jubilant fighters clambered over the wreckage, hoisted the independence flag over the compound walls, and looted symbols of the fallen dictator's extravagance as trophies of their historic victory. As Bab al-Azizia fell and the capital slipped entirely from government control, the central question for both the victorious rebels and the international community became, where was Muammar Gaddafi? Throughout the final days of the battle for Tripoli, the aging leader had remained defiant, releasing fiery audio messages via state media and calling upon his supporters to fight to the death to defend the nation against what he characterized as foreign colonial aggressors. Yet, as his command structure dissolved and his inner circle fractured completely, Gaddafi vanished from public view. State television stations fell silent or were seized by rebel forces, and the once ubiquitous voice of the Desert King ceased broadcasting across the airwaves. Intelligence, reports, and eyewitness accounts later indicated that Gaddafi, recognizing that Tripoli was no longer tenable, had slipped out of the sprawling Bab al-Azizia compound during the height of the fighting, transitioning from the opulent halls of power into a desperate, clandestine existence on the run. The disappearance of the fallen leader marked a surreal and tense epilogue to the fall of Tripoli. While millions of Libyans celebrated the end of the regime in the streets of the capital and cities across the country, the transitional leadership and rebel commanders knew that the revolution could not be considered complete while the former dictator remained at large. Speculation swirled regarding his whereabouts, with intelligence agencies and opposition leaders tracking rumors that he had fled south toward his tribal stronghold of Sirte or slipped across porous desert borders into neighboring friendly territory. The government he had constructed over 42 years had utterly disintegrated in a matter of days, leaving behind a power vacuum, a traumatized infrastructure, and a country overflowing with weapons. The fall of Tripoli was an undeniable turning point that brought an end to the formal institutions of the Jamahiriya. But it also set the stage for the final, desperate chapter of the civil war, as the hunt for the fugitive leader began across the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Libyan desert. Following the stunning and rapid collapse of Tripoli in August 2011, Muammar Gaddafi vanished from the public eye, leaving behind the shattered remains of his capital city and the sprawling administrative apparatus he had constructed over more than 4 decades. As the Transitional National Council and its allied armed brigades took control of government institutions, ministries, and state media outlets, the hunt for the fugitive leader became the supreme focus of the new authorities. Intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and eyewitness testimonies quickly confirmed that Gaddafi had not fled the country, nor had he sought refuge across distant foreign borders. Instead, he had retreated eastward toward the arid coastal plains and desert expanses surrounding his birthplace and ancestral tribal stronghold of Sirte. This loyalist bastion on the Mediterranean coast was destined to become the final theater of the Libyan civil war, a grim and protracted battleground where the destiny of the falling regime would reach its ultimate conclusion. Sirte was much more than a military objective for the loyalist diehards. It was the symbolic heartland of Gaddafi's support base. Raised among the Kadadfa tribe in the harsh desert terrain just outside the city, Gaddafi had poured immense national wealth, prestige, and development projects into Sirte during his rule, transforming it from a modest fishing village into a gleaming secondary capital complete with massive conference halls, luxury hotels, and modern infrastructure. As the revolution swept across the country, local residents, loyalist militiamen, and remaining elite security units who remained deeply devoted to the fallen leader rallied to defend the city. They viewed the advancing anti-Gaddafi forces not as liberators, but as foreign-backed usurpers bent on destroying the social and economic gains of the Jamahiriya. For the inhabitants of Sirte, the defense of the city was framed as a final, sacred stand for honor, tribal loyalty, and the preservation of the revolution. By September 2011, anti-Gaddafi revolutionary brigades from Misrata, Benghazi, and the Western Mountains converged on Sirte from multiple directions, establishing a tightening siege around the city limits. What many hoped would be a swift capitulation quickly turned into a brutal, grinding urban conflict. Unlike the open desert highways, where NATO air power could easily target armored columns, Sirte's dense residential neighborhoods, narrow streets, and concrete multi-story buildings offered ideal cover for entrenched loyalist snipers, rocket-propelled grenade teams, and heavy artillery batteries. Gaddafi's loyalists fought with fierce, desperate determination, fully aware that they were defending the last remaining stronghold of the regime. Day after day, the city echoed with the deafening roar of artillery exchanges, heavy machine gun fire, and the persistent hum of coalition warplanes circling high above the dust-choked skies. Inside the besieged city, Muammar Gaddafi was moving constantly through a network of safe houses, secret underground shelters, and modest residential hideouts, accompanied by a dwindling circle of loyal bodyguards, family members, and high-ranking regime loyalists. Among them was his long-serving defense minister, Abu Bakr Yunis, and a small cadre of hardened security personnel who remained steadfastly committed to protecting him to the bitter end. Conditions inside the shrinking loyalist enclave deteriorated with terrifying speed. Fresh water supplies were cut off, food became extremely scarce, medical facilities were overwhelmed and running out of basic surgical supplies, and the constant bombardment reduced residential blocks to mountains of gray rubble and twisted steel. Despite the hopeless military situation, intercepted messages and later testimonies revealed that Gaddafi remained defiant, issuing sporadic audio recordings urging his remaining followers to fight on and reject the legitimacy of the transitional government. By mid-October, the humanitarian crisis inside Sirte reached catastrophic proportions, while military pressure from the encircling revolutionary brigades became overwhelming. Coalition airstrikes and concentrated artillery fire systematically dismantled the remaining loyalist defense lines, splitting the besieged enclave into smaller, isolated pockets of resistance. Street by street and house by house fighting raged through the neighborhoods, leaving heavy casualties on both sides and displacing thousands of terrified civilians who managed to flee the conflict zone through narrow humanitarian corridors. The inner core of loyalist resistance was compressed into a tiny residential district known as District 2, where fighters and leadership alike were cornered in a dense labyrinth of unfinished concrete buildings and walled courtyards, completely cut off from escape or reinforcement. The final hours of the siege began in the pre-dawn darkness of October 20, 2011. Recognizing that the defensive perimeter was completely shattered, and that holding out any longer was entirely impossible, a desperate convoy of roughly 50 heavily armed loyalist vehicles attempted a high-risk breakout under the cover of early morning darkness and thick smoke. The plan was to punch through the western lines of the besieging revolutionary forces and race out toward the open desert toward the south. However, the breakout attempt was detected almost immediately. A watchful NATO surveillance aircraft patrolling the skies above Sirte spotted the moving convoy and launched a precision airstrike that crippled the lead vehicles, throwing the escaping column into immediate chaos, scattering debris across the desert highway, and forcing the survivors to abandon their vehicles and seek cover in nearby drainage pipes, abandoned farmhouses, and irrigation ditches. In the chaotic aftermath of the airstrike, Muammar Gaddafi, accompanied by a few remaining bodyguards and his defense minister, scrambled away from the burning vehicles and took refuge inside a pair of large concrete drainage pipes running beneath the main highway. As revolutionary fighters closed in to clear the area, a fierce firefight erupted around the drainage culverts. Gaddafi was wounded in the leg by shrapnel from a grenade tossed by approaching fighters, and his bodyguards were quickly overwhelmed or killed in the exchange. Stripped of his command, his bodyguards, and his elaborate illusions of absolute power, the former dictator was pulled from the concrete pipe by the surrounding revolutionary fighters, bringing a sudden, unceremonious end to his weeks of clandestine wandering and more than 42 years of authoritarian rule. News of his capture spread across Libya and around the world with astonishing speed, triggering scenes of ecstatic celebration in Tripoli, Benghazi, and cities across the nation where citizens poured into the streets to dance, wave flags, and fire celebratory shots into the air. However, the circumstances surrounding his final moments quickly became a subject of intense international controversy and profound domestic debate. Video footage captured by fighters at the scene showed a bloodied, dazed, and disoriented Gaddafi being dragged through the chaotic crowd amidst shouts, shoves, and intense confusion before he succumbed to fatal injuries sustained while in custody. The dramatic and violent manner of his death shocked foreign observers and highlighted the deep, raw divisions that the decades of brutal repression and civil war had left etched into the Libyan social fabric. The death of Muammar Gaddafi in the arid dust of Sirte marked the definitive closure of a monumental and turbulent chapter in modern Libyan history. The man who had risen from a poor Bedouin tent near the very same desert city to overthrow a king, construct an idiosyncratic political philosophy, challenge global superpowers, and rule an oil-rich nation with an iron fist for over 4 decades, was gone. His demise left behind a nation profoundly transformed yet deeply fractured, struggling to emerge from the ashes of a devastating civil war and facing the daunting, uncertain task of building a new democratic future from the wreckage of the fallen Jamahiriya. The death of Muammar Gaddafi in the dust of Sirte brought a definitive and dramatic close to more than 4 decades of absolute rule in Libya. The man who had risen from a humble Bedouin tent to overthrow a monarch, construct an idiosyncratic political philosophy, challenge global superpowers, and rule an oil-rich nation with an unyielding iron grip was gone. Yet, as the smoke cleared across the scarred landscape of the Mediterranean coast, Libyans were left to reckon with a deeply complicated and deeply polarizing legacy. The story of Gaddafi's long reign is not one of simple categorization. It is a tapestry of profound contradictions, marked by sweeping social transformations on one hand and severe political repression on the other. For millions of citizens, the memory of the Jamahiriya years evokes starkly opposing emotions, splitting public opinion and framing the immense challenges that continue to shape Libya's modern identity. To understand the enduring support that Gaddafi commanded among a significant portion of the population, one must examine the tangible changes he brought to everyday life, particularly during the early and middle decades of his rule. Before the 1969 coup, Libya was among the poorest nations in the world, heavily dependent on foreign aid and burdened by staggering rates of illiteracy and disease. With the nationalization of the oil industry in the 1970s, vast rivers of petroleum revenue began to flow directly into state coffers. Gaddafi channeled these unprecedented riches into massive national infrastructure projects that fundamentally altered the country's social fabric. Modern schools, universities, and hospitals sprouted in cities and remote desert oases alike. Free education and universal health care were established as fundamental rights, opening doors of opportunity for generations of Libyans who had previously been locked out of formal advancement. Ambitious housing programs sought to replace traditional shanty towns and mud-brick dwellings with concrete apartments, while agricultural initiatives like the Great Man-Made River Project attempted to extract ancient fossil water from deep beneath the Sahara to irrigate the arid coastal plains. For ordinary families who experienced stable employment, subsidized basic goods, and visible modernization, the Gaddafi era represented a period of national dignity, economic security, and social uplift. However, this narrative of progress and public welfare existed in stark and brutal contrast to the dark underside of the regime. Gaddafi's total refusal to tolerate political dissent created an atmosphere of pervasive fear and pervasive surveillance. From the earliest days of his rule, all forms of political opposition were ruthlessly outlawed. Independent political parties, free trade unions, and independent newspapers were banned, replaced by state-controlled media and revolutionary committees tasked with rooting out ideological deviance. Arbitrary arrests, prolonged detentions without trial, and severe instances of torture became standard tools of state control. The infamous Abu Salam prison in Tripoli stood as a grim monument to this repression, culminating in the horrific massacre of hundreds of inmates in 1996. Intellectuals, journalists, students, and religious figures who dared to question the tenets of the Green Book or criticize the regime's economic mismanagement were forced into exile or silenced permanently. Furthermore, Gaddafi's idiosyncratic political restructuring dismantled traditional state institutions, replacing them with a convoluted system of popular congresses that ultimately concentrated all real decision-making authority in the hands of the colonel and his inner circle of family members and loyal security chiefs. Corruption, administrative inefficiency, and rampant nepotism hollowed out public institutions, ensuring that the country's immense oil wealth enriched a privileged elite while ordinary citizens faced chronic shortages of consumer goods, failing infrastructure, and stagnant economic diversification. On the international stage, Gaddafi's foreign policy left a similarly turbulent and costly legacy. Driven by an ambitious vision of pan-Arab nationalism and African unity, he poured vast financial resources into supporting revolutionary movements, rebel groups, and insurgent factions across the globe. While some nations in the developing world viewed him as a champion of anti-imperialism and a generous benefactor, Western governments increasingly came to regard his regime as a dangerous state sponsor of terrorism. The confrontation escalated through the 1980s, marked by deadly economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military clashes with the United States. The shadow of the 1988 Lockerbie bombing and the 1989 UTA flight bombing cast a devastating pall over Libya, resulting in international embargoes that crippled the national economy and isolated the country from the global community for over a decade. Though Gaddafi engineered a dramatic diplomatic rehabilitation in the early 2000s by dismantling his unconventional weapons programs and settling international compensation claims, the deep-seated mistrust generated by decades of erratic foreign adventures left Libya vulnerable and friendless when the 2011 crisis erupted. The ultimate collapse of the Jamahiriya unleashed forces that went far beyond the removal of a single dictator. Decades of authoritarian rule had left Libya entirely devoid of democratic institutions, civil society organizations, or national political parties capable of managing a peaceful transition of power. When the regime fell, it left behind a profound power vacuum filled by a fragmented mosaic of regional militias, tribal factions, and ideological competitors. The weapons caches amassed by Gaddafi during his 42 years in power flooded across borders, fueling regional conflicts and empowering extremist networks. Instead of stepping into a peaceful and prosperous democratic dawn, Libya plunged into years of devastating civil conflict, economic paralysis, and institutional division, with rival governments vying for control of the nation's vital oil reserves. Ultimately, history's judgment on Muammar Gaddafi remains deeply divided and unresolved. To his detractors, he was a ruthless tyrant whose megalomania, violent repression, and disastrous economic policies inflicted incalculable suffering on his people and reduced a wealthy nation to a fractured battleground. To his defenders and nostalgics, he was a visionary revolutionary who stood up to foreign domination, built a welfare state out of desert sand, and provided his citizens with security and prosperity that vanished the moment he was overthrown. As Libya continues its long and painful struggle to heal the wounds of the past and forge a stable future, the shadow of the desert